The opinions expressed on this program are solely those of its hosts, guests, or callers, and do not necessarily represent the opinions of WTBR-FM, its management, other producers, or sponsors.
Before we start this program, we'd like to issue a trigger warning. This program deals with specific traumas, including the Holocaust, and may be disturbing to some people.
Welcome to Living Well into the Future with your host, Judy B. Adler. In the past episodes in the Resilience series, we have spoken about resilience for groups of people through economic development, resilience justice, and education. The next two episodes will focus on an individual's resilience in response to traumatic events, whether caused by man or nature.
Write to us to let us know if this or any of our other episodes have given rise to discussions or actions on your part. Let us know which episodes were relevant to your life, what other topics you might like us to cover. You can reach us through our website, livingwellintothefuture.net, where you can get more information about our guests, show notes, and information about past episodes. Or you can write to us at lwitf@gmail.com.
Hi, I'm your host, Judy B. Adler. People have been asking me why we're doing a series about resilience. It's because in our current world we see war, climate calamities, and political turmoil. We hope that the knowledge of efforts and actions by our guests taken to promote resilience will give our listeners insights into how to build resilience or be resilient when faced with traumatic events or circumstances in the future. In previous episodes in the Resilience series, you have heard about economic resilience, resilience justice, and resilience through education. In this episode, we look at the factors that create resilient families and individuals so that we can consider building an armory of actions that will allow us to meet and survive future traumas with positive rather than negative outcomes. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Bea Hollander Goldfein, a researcher and licensed clinical psychologist at the Council for Relationships in Philadelphia, where she also teaches postgraduates in the Marriage and Family Therapy program. As you will hear, she was one of the founders of the Transcending Trauma Project, which has investigated the resilience of survivors of the Holocaust and their families for the past 30 years to draw conclusions that are now being applied to understanding and promoting resilience in people affected by traumatic events. Our second guest is Bernice Lewis, a singer-songwriter and teacher from the Berkshires in Massachusetts. She is the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, not a participant in the Transcending Trauma Project. Her family history and resilience brings to life the transmission of the impact of traumatic events across generations. Our third guest is Judy Levin, a clinical social worker who has worked on the Transcending Trauma Project for 20 years. She'll speak with us about how the project has affected her own life. Welcome, Dr. Bea Hollander Goldfein. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I've introduced you to our listeners, but would you please tell us more about your background?
I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have been working at the Council for Relationships, which is a clinical and training center, since the 80s. And in my role at the council, not only am I a therapist and a supervisor, but I also am an instructor in our postgraduate program in marriage and family therapy. And in the program, we teach a broad range of topics to prepare people to do systemic therapy. And one of the topics is trauma. And I taught the research in the field and some trauma studies. And with colleagues of mine at the council, we were saying the field is steeped in a negative view of trauma. that anyone who has gone through trauma has a response that is a negative profile. This is not our experience of the people we work with as clients, of the people we know in life. And if our own families have gone through trauma, it is not what we see. Yes, there are some negative responses for some people, but certainly not for everyone. So, being concerned with that, we formed a study group for about 3, 4 years. And we would study trauma of rape, trauma of terminal illness, of physical violence, of crime, and observed in general in the field, the focus was negative. And we said that we really wanted to address this. We said the only way to address it is to really do life histories with those people who've gone through trauma. So we have the sort of sense of pre-trauma, what the trauma was like, and post-trauma. So we had a perspective of how they coped, but where they came from as individuals. And we decided to focus on Holocaust survivors, some of us being connected to Holocaust families, and others coming from the Jewish community being very interested in that. Some not coming from the Jewish community, but very interested. So we committed ourselves to studying, researching, talking to Holocaust survivors, but being systemic practitioners, which mean that we believe that individual issues do not belong just to the individual. They exist within family systems. Our commitment was to understand the family systems of survivor families. So we began an interview-based project, which is called qualitative research, interviewing survivors and their children, and when possible, their grandchildren. Our goal was to get the broad perspective of coping, to understand coping when it is adaptive, when it does help people move forward, and then to see what happens for those people who get caught in the traumatic response and can't move, and see what happens intergenerationally. And so it was really a response to the negative focus in the field. And we said, this is not real. We're going to explore what we feel is real in human life.
How many people did you wind up interviewing over the 30-year period?
307 interviews, 95 survivors, the rest children and grandchildren and family members. And over the years, we've had about 25 people involved in the research. Part of that was doing the interviews. Part of that was the analysis. There have been many people devoted to the project over the years. Part of that was the analysis of the interviews. You're sitting down with 12 hours of material. It's all typed out in narrative form. How do you make sense of that? How do you narrow it down to an understanding of functioning? So yes, there have been many people devoted to the project over the years.
Judy Levin, a clinical social worker, is one of those people. Good morning, Judy Levin.
Good morning.
Judy's life has been impacted by the project, both in terms of her participation and also in how it impacted her resilience in the face of family tragedy.
I just felt it was an important project and that I could contribute.
As a clinical social worker working with clients over a range of difficult issues, how is this project important?
Bea is a child of survivors, and a couple of the other people in the project are children of survivors, but there are also a large number who are not. The uniqueness, I think, of this project is up until then, so we're talking in the late 80s, early 90s, most of the research was very negative, that you couldn't have survived the project without enormous costs to your emotional stability, to what you need to do in order to live. That everything was negative, that it would be unable to surpass this. And B, and a couple of the other children of survivors who were also working at the Council for Relationships said, gee, that's not our experience. And B said, we should look into this. So that's how it originally started, that her family, even though there are issues, how come her parents were able to, they came here, they couldn't speak the language, they got jobs, they got married, they had children, they had mostly successful lives. There were certainly issues, but how come? What were the dynamics? So she developed this paradigm of qualitative relational dynamics. And there were negative dynamics and positive dynamics. And we would meet with triads, three people, one who had done the interview, one who was a reader for the triad, and one who participated somehow in the transcription of the interview. So we would meet on, I don't know, it could take 6 months to complete an interview, filling out all of the forms. And we had all these forms and discussions. And then in 2005, my daughter, who was 34 at the time, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she lived for 3 years, died in 2008. And at that point, I actually retired from the project for a while. Then we also moved from Philadelphia to Western Massachusetts, and I could no longer attend the meetings. COVID allowed me to rejoin. But all during that time, I felt that the survivors had really spoken to me in terms of if they could survive what they survived and go on and lead a normal life, then I could too. They were really my role models. And that was really what kept me going and returning to the project during COVID when we got Zoom meetings started again.
Bea spoke about coping as one of the things that the project investigated. Bea, is coping the same thing as resilience?
If essentially the coping adaptation is positive, productive, quote, healthy, and moving forward, we would call that resilience. Okay? And if not, we wouldn't use the term resilience. We would talk about ongoing traumatic impact. To me, resilience is the descriptor of what you observe in terms of coping and adaptation. So, what you're studying is coping and adaptation. Your conclusion, your ultimate observation, is whether or not an individual and family is resilient, has rebuilt their lives to a productive, constructive place.
There are two things that I'd like to focus on. One, the conclusions that you came to, and two, the general applicability.
Okay, big question. So there are many things that we studied as part of this process. What's the role of faith? What is the role of emotional connectedness, et cetera, et cetera? But overall, the broad findings are number one, that the trauma itself that parents may experience is not a direct link to negative responses in the second generation. Okay. What mediates the impact of the trauma, because the traumatized parents may have various reactions to the trauma, especially the Holocaust with its extremity. You don't have people who walked out rebuilding unscathed lives. Everybody's impacted on a continuum of differences. What impacts the children predominantly as the mediating factor is the relationship between the parents and the children. It's how the parents parent the child that will impact how the child develops, but also how the child incorporates the reality of a parent's trauma. So if the parent suffers from nightmares, let's say, but the parent can still hold that as their pain, but parent well, the child can grow up and develop in a healthy way, have some perspective of the parent's trauma, but bring a healthy capacity of self and a healthy capacity of relationships to their adulthood. But if the parent, whatever their experience of the trauma in the aftermath, parents poorly, then that child does not develop in a healthy way, not because their parents were traumatized, but because of how the parent parented the child. If that parenting is negative, then the child struggles in childhood and then has various challenges in adulthood. So the quality of that relationship is critically important in terms of enabling the next generation to develop psychologically in a healthy way. Along with those dynamics, I'm going to say them if that's okay. There are five
Please,
dynamics.
please.
Is the continuum between closeness and distance, right? How close is the parent to the child? Some survivors, especially in the extreme case of the Holocaust, they were unable to connect after the war. They would be physically present but not able to connect. The second dynamic is empathy for the child versus being self-centered. I'm here to care for you versus I need you to take care of me. Okay. Validation versus criticism, giving the child a positive sense of self versus always being critical from the parent's angst, anxiety, anger. Expressing positive emotions on the continuum to negative emotions, and open communication versus closed communication. So, for a moment, let me talk about communication because the other dynamics, the other factors are clear. They're about the quality of the interaction between parent and child. Communication is part of that interaction because we're talking either verbally or non-verbally. But the other piece of communication that's critically important is the parent who's gone through the trauma, being able to inform the child in an age-appropriate way what they went through, what happened to them, what explains their background. Because children who grow up in what the field has called silence are very troubled because the emotional environment of the household has a heaviness, has an emotional reality to it that the child doesn't understand. They might know my parents went through the Holocaust, but they don't know what happened. So open communication, not just in what do you need for school today or what happened with your friend, but opportunities where a child says, what happened to you? What happened to grandma and grandpa? Being able to explain that to the child gives them a capacity to know, knowing even if what you know is very painful and tragic, allows one to have that sense of knowing and feel some stability. It's the not knowing and silence that is very negative. So it's the quality of the connection between the survivor parent and the child that is critical, but also that the communication informs the child of what has come before. So again, it's not the fact that the parent might have been in Auschwitz that by definition creates a child who's traumatized. It's how the parent after Auschwitz in their new lives were able to parent their child that will determine whether or not that child can live a fully positive life or a challenged life.
Thank you, Bea. While we're absorbing what you've told us about family dynamics and the effect on the resilience of future generations, let's speak with Bernice Lewis, a daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, who, through her family history, shares how those dynamics affected her life. Our guest, Bernice Lewis, was not a part of the TTP study. I first met Bernice, a singer-songwriter and teacher, when I interviewed her for my Life Shifts program about people who are passionate about what they do. Good to see you again, Bernice. One of the things that you do is go into middle schools and high schools and talk to them about your family and the Holocaust. Would you please tell us about your family?
My father and grandmother came here together from Germany in 1941. And one of the things I do as part of my work is I go into mostly junior highs and I tell their story, show some day in the life type pictures, nothing graphic at all. and sing a few songs. And in the process of singing those songs, I widen it into a history lesson that's not painful, dates and figures and stuff like that, and talk about the bigger picture. And I've done that for a long time now, probably 20 years, in a handful of schools that keep having me back.
Growing up, what was your awareness of the Holocaust? Did they talk about it?
I don't remember not knowing about the Holocaust, which is always very interesting to me when people talk about it like it may or may not happened. And I was also always surprised that other people didn't know anything about it. To me, it was like, of course, that's what happened. But the ways in which they talked about it were probably, that I remember, were probably a little more subtle. Like, my grandmother used to do this thing when I would visit her where she brought a lot of photos with her when she came out. And they weren't in camps, no extended family, that they're all gone. But she would get out her books, her picture books, and she would talk to me about this one and that one. And then she'd just look off and say, they didn't make it, or they're in Australia, or something like that. They're in North Dakota. Or she kept up a very healthy correspondence for her entire life with whoever she could. So it was just a known topic, but I don't have a moment in time where I remember them telling me about it. Like, it just was there.
So where did they live?
So they lived in Berlin, and they came out in 1941.
And how did they get out?
That's pretty much the story I tell when I go to schools. My grandmother was there during Kristallnacht, and my father was living at a boarding school, and she took the opportunity to send him to France, which a lot of people did, and nobody thought Hitler was going to invade France or that he would succeed. So she thought he was safe, and then when Hitler did invade France, my father ran away from school and lived on the streets of Paris, and my grandmother somehow got a visa for both of them, but had to bring him back into Germany to have his visa validated. And then they came out on trains and in a boat from Lisbon. And when I did that residency this year in Costa Rica, I spent a lot of time researching the details of how they got out, because I interviewed both of them before they died and got a lot of information, but there's still questions I wish I had asked. I don't exactly know when she got the visa. She just basically said, one day I was going out to lunch with a friend who said, you should apply, and I did. And she made it sound like it was a surprise when the visa came through right when my dad was missing. She also told me that in order to get the word to him that he had to come back, she had to go to the Gestapo 3 times and would never talk about what happened while she was there, to somehow get my father back into the country.
How did you get that information?
When my stepmother died, she took all the paperwork in the basement and sent it to the Holocaust Museum, what I have and translate. Yeah, so she did bring a lot of stuff. The other thing I did find out, though, is she had a beloved niece, my father's only cousin. Neither of them had siblings, that she talked about all the time, and had told me that when she was coming through Paris on the train, this niece, whose name was Ellie, met her and gave her pictures and food and announced that she was engaged to be married, but that her father had been deported to a concentration camp in France. And the thing is that, because when you think about the way news travels now is so fast, but it didn't travel like that. So in their minds, it was a holding tank. And so they went to be with him. And so I did a bunch of research on her. I dug pretty deep and wrote to a place in Germany called the Arlsen Archives in March. And 2 weeks ago, I woke up and was checking my email, and they sent me the paperwork that she had died in Auschwitz, that they'd all 3 had been deported from this concentration camp in Paris called Drancy, which is spelled like Nancy with a D and N, and to Auschwitz. And there was paperwork that they sent me. They had it of the deportation train she was on, and it's awful. She was 23 years old. That I didn't know.
Your grandmother didn't live with you, but did she live nearby?
She did. We were all living in the greater Boston area, and she was a very proactive grandmother. She had only my father. She was a very modern woman. She was not religious. She got divorced when my father was really small, so we never met my grandfather. He never met his father. She was a matriarch, and even though my parents were divorced, she was very insistent on staying close with my siblings and I. And she spent her retirement full-time and bilingual secretary for the Jewish Family and Children Services in Boston, working on getting restitution for other survivors. She did that till the day she died. She was formidable. And that's how she got out. She was formidable. And she got out really late. And she left behind her mother and her oldest sister, not knowing what would happen to them. Yeah.
She came here, she was proactive, she was able to not only get herself out, but her son out, and then she went on to have a career in which she made an impact.
She did. Her first job in most of her younger career situation before she retired was at Harvard Medical School as a bilingual secretary for a neurologist who did brain research. And she didn't speak English when she came. She did domestic work. I don't know for how long, but knowing my grandmother wouldn't have been very long. And she was stately. She was 6 feet tall. She was a very large woman. She was extremely resilient and stubborn and seemingly somewhat fearless, but probably not, just seemingly. And I don't know.
So how did it affect your father?
My father was not a good father. He was a deadbeat. And it took me a long time to forgive him. I had to mature to the point where I understood that experiencing puberty and Hitler simultaneously is not a great combo. He was very self-centered. One time I said to a therapist he was paranoid schizophrenic, and she said, was he really a schizophrenic? And I said, no, I didn't know well enough at that point what that meant. And she said, okay, if what you fear is real, it's not really paranoia. And that's true. What he feared was absolutely real. So as an adult, he carried a gun places. He would come to my folk music concerts with a gun. And he didn't come very often, but when he did, he would have one in there. It wasn't open carry, but he would have it in there. He was a survivor. And there's this fallacy, I think, about survivors that I figured out from meeting many of them as I did more research, which is that they're the ones that survived. My husband is Mr. Peace Corps. He would have given all his bread away and his coat and anything else. My father was not that person. He survived. Survival was important to him. I don't know what he did. In order to get from France back to Berlin, he told us he didn't have any paperwork. That he buried his paperwork in the dirt when he ran away from school. And then he lied to the soldiers that were guarding the trains back into Germany and said he was going home to serve the fatherland. But on his deathbed, he told his wife, and I don't talk about this. There's things I can't talk about when I go into junior high schools, right?
Yeah.
Told his wife that he pushed a soldier in front of a moving train and hopped on. That's the story that came back to us at the very end. Knowing my father, it's possible that he wanted to survive badly enough. He was 16. He just wasn't capable of the kind of love that most parents are capable of. And as a parent now, I can see what that feels like. And I know that I did not get that from him. He did love me, but not in a way that was parental. He was a survivor. Whereas my grandmother, she would have been 40 when they emigrated. She was a mature adult who had to, so she was definitely capable of parental type love. Yeah.
So you got it from your grandmother, not from your...
Yeah. And my mother. My parents, they were different.
So how do you think it affected you and your choices and your view of the world?
That's a really big question. Sometimes the way I explain it to people when I get into these kinds of conversations is that if I'm not careful, if I don't work with it, there's just a black and white newsreel that just runs around in the back of my brain. And I will think about the Holocaust more than I talk about it. If I'm cold, I will sometimes remind myself that I'm going to be warm soon, but if I was in a concentration camp, that would not be the case. I feel closer to it than I want to feel. I feel like I was the oldest and female, so there was no buffer. I was the one that they would tell me things. And my mom the divorce was pretty bad. I didn't think of myself as a child of survivors for a long time because they weren't in camps. And then I started meeting people who had been in camps that were exactly my father's age, and they did things just exactly like my father. I was like, okay, maybe that wasn't the prereq. But I've read enough testimony. I did a bunch of writing this winter, and I don't want to stay completely focused on it, but I can't write about my family without writing about it. And so I did a bunch more research, and whenever I tell someone, they go, oh my God, you've got to read this testimony or watch this movie. And I wish they could understand that I can't really absorb more, because every story that I've absorbed, it just stays in there. It doesn't ever go away. And that's the same when I read about Central Americans crossing the desert and kids living in a tent in Gaza, hostages, and it's the same. I can't unsee those stories, and there's enough of them in there. But with the Holocaust, I feel too close, way too close. One generation just isn't enough to feel like you could have been there easily. You could have been panic-stricken and confused and in denial and all the things that I've read about and talked about with people. I think about what it would mean to have peace on Earth. And I think I don't think we're psychologically prepared for it. I think it would be somewhat boring. We live on these stories, and the stories would be different. I think we can still have hope. We'll still have problems if we were to ever be a peaceful species, but we'll still have problems to solve for sure. But stories like this would go away. Genocide, persecution, sexism, racism, that's what has to be eradicated. We can't eradicate cancers and accidents and things like that, family struggles. But yeah, we can certainly, or we should be able to get rid of war. We don't seem to be doing a very good job. When I think war basically defined my childhood. That's just,
Even though you were born after the war.
I was born after the war. Yeah. If you were born to people who lived through World War II in that way, it was just always there. It was always there. How could it not be? It was just always there. The fear of spending money, because the only thing my grandmother used to say, every problem can be solved with money. But what that meant was she knew that she got out of Germany because she had the resources to do it, and then had to come back and build up more resources. If she hadn't had those resources, it would have been a different story. So there's that, and her relationships were with other immigrants. I think that she tried to hold on. She thought of herself as German. She didn't abandon her German habits. She would go to the fancy bakeries on Sunday and bring those pastries. Were phenomenal back then, and have a coffee clutch every Sunday with all of us. And she browned her cauliflower and burnt butter and all these German things. She didn't talk about the concentration camps because she hadn't been to one, but she knew enough about them, I'm sure, from all the people she helped. She helped a lot of people. The day she died, there was still a half-finished letter in her typewriter. So, and therefore, she's living inside that time all the time. There's no getting around it.
Did she inspire you in a positive way, or?
Oh, I never thought about that, but she just wasn't as messed up as my dad was. She was more mentally healthy, so she was supportive. I don't think anyone in my family had any thought or interest in supporting me or I don't know about my sister because she's 2 years younger. Everything I wanted to do, go to college, I had to do that completely on my own. That was a given. Nothing was in my wedding too. But she was an inspiring person. Yeah.
But she didn't have the same a loving component.
She was tall and stately and not affectionate. I don't remember her ever holding me. And she worried a lot about my dad. I think she worried about him a lot. And rightly, I think it made sense to worry. If I was his mother, I would worry about him too. He didn't always make the best decisions. Uh,
Well, when you go into the high schools, what is your theme? What are you trying to impart to them?
I actually took a picture of the Holocaust Memorial and Government Center in Boston has a detailed outline that's etched in stone. And I integrated little basic facts into my story. And then I literally tell the kids right up front, I never liked history until I figured out that history was just people's stories. I'm going to put these dates down because it'll make your teachers happy. And that works. And then I tell the story just start to finish. This is what happened. Play a few songs, talk about the camps a little bit, not a lot, because I think also I find that one of the problems with talking about the Holocaust or reading about it and writing about it is that people are attracted to the sensationalism of it. They like that. It's like watching murder movies on TV, which I don't do either, but they're attracted to that part. And that's why I thought my story wasn't all that valuable, or my father and grandmother's. At the end, if there's a way and a time to wrap it up, I encourage them to ask their families about where they're from. Because nowadays I'm staring out at a sea of multicolored faces. And I tell them that every family has a story and that it makes a difference to know that story and that they think you actually know the story. They think because they know. And they also may not want to traumatize you, but it's better to know, I think. And so that's the wrap up. And then usually 7th and 8th graders don't have a lot of questions.
Thank you, Bernice Lewis, for speaking with me. You can find out more about Bernice and hear her music and if and where she is playing at a venue near you at bernicelewis.com. Her music is on Spotify, and we will link to her website in our show notes on livingwellintothefuture.net. Let's get back to Dr. Bea Hollander Goldfein. Bea, I quote from the Transcending Trauma Project website, which we'll provide a link to in our show notes. It says, the themes and findings from the TTP apply to diverse populations who have been affected by trauma, such as Rwandan genocide survivors, U.S. military families, survivors of gun violence, people with disabilities, and marginalized segments of society oppressed by racism and prejudice. Themes pertaining to coping, adaptation, family dynamics, communication styles, and intergenerational transmission of trauma speak to a wide range of individuals, families, communities, and cultures. So, what can TTP's findings teach our listeners about how to be resilient?
I want to distinguish between the teaching of the findings of the Transcending Trauma Project through coursework and through conferences versus applying this research methodology to other groups. Okay. So whenever we have presented this material at conferences, either mental health conferences or community-based conferences, it is very common for people to come up afterwards from various groups within society and say, that speaks to me. That makes sense to me in terms of what I experienced, so the problems I experienced, the difficulties in the family, the lack of communication. And so there was this general sense that this speaks very broadly. And if you sit back and you take your mental health hat off, it does, from a very common sense place, speak more broadly. It has research evidence, so we tend to rely on our common sense more when there's research evidence. But of course, the dynamics of a family have a lot to do with how the next generation copes, and communication has a lot to do with how the next generation copes. So anyone who's experienced anything on this continuum will say, oh, that speaks to me. And if you look at the Black experience within America, if you look at the immigrant refugee experience or the Hispanic experience, the Latinx experience in America, that was fraught fraught with difficulty and challenge and negative impacts on families being broken apart and not living in safety. Again, unique to each group. Okay. Again, common sense, we understand that there's an ongoing intergenerational challenge that is going on for these groups. Now, each group has its own cultural dimension. For example, for many immigrant groups, the culture back in the home country was number one, not to share hardship outside the family, and for some cultures, not to share hardship even with children. So that aspect has a cultural contribution to it. So each group needs to also address its cultural impacts. And then within that, to understand how to work towards improving the quality of family dynamics and communication. So ideally, it would be, I think, great if other groups, other researchers would adopt this methodology of doing a life history to know the factors contributing, the trauma itself, and post, to understand and apply this to other groups in a more scientific way. Okay. But the enormity of our project is very hard for other groups to pick up. It was years of inquiry. But the general sense that if you look at the key factors for transmission of trauma, that's the language in the literature, or intergenerational transmission of trauma, the importance of looking at the family dynamics is crucial. So if a family is in conflict within the trauma of society where they exist, the children are vulnerable, not only to the reality that the trauma still exists in society, but the family's in conflict. So their basic psychological development is being impacted. And therefore, they're responding to both the difficulty of the family dynamics and ongoing, let's say, for example, racism. But if you have a family that within the family, there is an attempt for positive dynamics, cohesion, and a certain kind of communication, and research is showing this for Black families, how important parental communication is for the second generation, then there is the potential for the second generation to cope well, to live from a sense of healthy productivity and learn how to cope with the challenge of ongoing racism. They're strengthened in terms of the capacity to cope if there's a certain dynamic within the family. Okay. And as I said, there is research on those dynamics that have been going on for a number of years.
Up to this point, we've been talking about the conclusions of your 30-year research project. And now let's turn and look a little more closely as to how it applies to the individual. Do you do therapy?
I'm a therapist, yes. So there, if again, a very broad question, and two parts to that question. The one is, how does the person who has experienced the trauma cope? And then what does that person bring to the family dynamics? Okay. So the family dynamics part is very important. And basically that would say that someone who's gone through hardship in life, whether it's one shot or ongoing or repeated, needs to somehow cope with that trauma in a way where they can internally experience a choice of how to relate to their children. So if they're coping with flashbacks or anxieties or anger or somehow shut down, but they're raising children, because you have the capacity to explore within yourself, how can they hold their pain in such a way where they can parent in a way that's validating and empathic and connected to the child? And that's not easy because many people who have been traumatized can't gain that perspective. They're too immersed in their trauma and they don't even perceive the impact of their interaction. So working for that self-awareness is important. The other part of it, how does the trauma survivor cope? And it is very important for that coping, which is a piece of this story, and that is a trauma survivor, whatever they experience, needs to face that trauma directly. They need to acknowledge it. It can't be avoided. You can't run away from it. You can't overlay it with some positive focus on the future because it is always there inside. It is essential for people who've gone through trauma to face that trauma. It is essential that they can retell that trauma, which would often happen in a therapeutic environment, but to really tell it to its core. And then once that is done, there is the freedom psychologically, and there are ways to talk about that psychologically, which I won't do at this moment. But once that is fully told, fully shared, fully faced, it becomes possible psychologically. And I'm going to say very simply in terms of brain function, for there to be space for the person to explore their meaning system, what's important to them, what they value, and to have some space to choose how to live more constructively and freer from trauma's impact. Certainly, from that space, the person more in touch with self, it's a painful process, but they're more in touch with self ultimately, who can choose for themselves to live in a better space, can then give more positive interactions to their family. Now, in the case of Holocaust survivors, many of them had no opportunity, had no therapy, were struggling in this new country, rebuilding their families, nor did they even understand therapy coming from that era. In survivor families, you do have the continuum of those survivors who did manage to cope well, partially because of their positive backgrounds before the war, positive because they had the capacity to be aware of impact on children, and some survivors who suffered greatly, and it was a very negative home environment for their kids. But if there is the awareness and the availability of help for someone who's gone through trauma, whether or not they can do it within themselves or they need a professional, okay, confronting the trauma is painful but essential. Therefore, recovering a sense of self is important. And just one more sentence about that. When teams of mental health people go out to various parts of this country or the world to help people cope with some tragic experiences or ongoing extreme events, part of it is stability, comfort, connection, and part of it is the acknowledgement of what this trauma is. Because if I can face it, then I have some perspective of having some choice of how to live.
Your basis is family therapy.
No, the findings of the Transcending Trauma Project does have the family focus on what's the intergenerational impact. That is, as a therapist, I work mostly with individuals in terms of coping with their trauma.
And do you incorporate aspects of that into working with the individuals?
Yes. But again, it has the individual focus, which does speak to establishing stability, retelling, confronting, retelling the trauma, and then reconstructing meaning, self-esteem. But an individual is always in a family system. So there is always what is also going on in that person's life. For individuals coming from a distressing family circumstance, for whatever the reason, but they're attempting to cope with their own trauma, it might be a very intense session and constructive session. But for those individuals going back to distressed families, it's hard for them to hold on the sense of personal gain, that sense of personal stability, that I can be okay. I can choose how to live my life. I'm not victimized. But if they go back to distressed environments, they can't always hold on to that sense if they're responding to negative dynamics in the present within their own family. So you're right. There is the focus of therapy, and then all the other elements that are related to that.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about your work and about the trauma as it applies to the challenges that we have going forward?
Again, the topic could take days to discuss, but I do think that in general, there needs to be an honest confrontation with whatever's going on. 9/11, COVID, community conflict, even what's going on in society in general can be stressful. We wouldn't call it trauma, although some people might. But whatever it is, yes, there needs to be some self-care. There needs to be some sense of stability. There needs to be some sense of safety. If a person is in a chronic situation that is unsafe, there's no way to work with the trauma. So the first focus is safety and stability, self-awareness, self-care. That's the foundation. Once someone can have that, then it is crucially important to face whatever the stressor is. Face whatever the trauma is in an open and deep a way as is possible, which is an integrative process between our emotions, our thoughts, and our physiological experience. We experience anxiety and stress in our bodies, and we have negative belief systems. And we have anxious, negative, anticipatory feelings. We have all of them. So when you face a trauma or a challenge directly, it's what you feel about it, it's what you think about it, and it's what you experience in your body. When you can articulate all of that in as deep a way as possible, there is an integrative process that happens that allows us to feel ourselves in a more positive way and to feel that we have some self-determination, some choice. Okay. And that's because in our brain, the emotion functions in one area, thoughts function in another area, the visceral experience functions in another area. Whenever we're under threat, past or present, those qualities tend to splinter off. And our feelings are not always connected to our thoughts, or our thoughts are not always connected. And our body can have experiences that's disconnected to what we're thinking and feeling. When we can talk about our challenge and trauma fully, deeply, from all these perspectives, there is the process of integration within the brain, where the thoughts and feelings and visceral experience and how that's recorded up here tends to be integrated, and the brain reconnects as opposed to splinters off, which is the attempt to self-protect. But when they're integrated, we go through the process of integrating, so we're fully aware. We have a greater capacity to cope.
Thank you, Bea, for synthesizing so much information into such a short time period. I suspect that our listeners will be repeating this episode more than once to fully appreciate all you have shared with us. Our thanks to Dr. Bea Hollander Goldfein, Bernice Lewis, Judy Levin, and our AI announcer, Olive, as we continue our exploration of individual resilience in the face of community-wide traumas in order to gain insights we can consider, discuss, and use in order to live well into the future. On our next episode, we will speak with Diane Barth, clinical social worker, psychotherapist, who worked with clients in New York City after 9/11 and through COVID. We'll also speak with other guests. You can hear this and previous episodes of Living Well into the Future on WTBR-FM.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and other streaming services. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Let us know what other topics you might want to hear. Do you have any suggestions, comments? Write to us at lwitf22@gmail.com or through our website, livingwellintothefuture.net, where you can find show notes, past episodes, and information about our guests. Our thanks from me, Julie B. Adler to Berkshire Ollie, WTBR-FM 89.7 Pittsfield, and the Berkshire Eagle for their support. This podcast is produced by Julie Koppenheffer. Our music is written and performed by Michael Koppenheffer. The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and not of WTBR-FM, Berkshire Ollie, or the Berkshire Eagle, or the LWITF production team.